There is a door in Paris that most people walk past without noticing. It sits at the edge of a small square on the left bank, just south of the Boulevard Raspail, in a neighborhood of quiet apartment buildings and corner cafes. A modest stone pavilion, no taller than a garden shed, marks the entrance. Nothing about it suggests what lies beneath. Beyond that door, a narrow spiral staircase drops straight down. 131 steps carved in tight circles, descending roughly 20 meters below street level, the equivalent of a 5-story building, except you are going the wrong way. The air changes before the light does. A coolness rises from below, damp and mineral, and by the time you reach the bottom, the sounds of the city above have vanished entirely. You are standing in a limestone corridor, roughly cut, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The ceiling is low, the walls are pale and wet, and ahead of you stretches a passage that seems to have no end. This is the entrance to the Catacombs of Paris, and what you are about to walk through is the largest underground ossuary in the world. For about 1.5 kilometers, the public route winds through tunnels lined with human remains, skulls and femurs stacked in careful rows, tibias arranged in repeating patterns, entire walls made of bone. Behind those decorative facades lie deeper piles, less organized, stretching back into the dark. The bones of more than 6 million people rest here, transferred from the city's overflowing cemeteries over the course of decades, beginning in the late 18th century. At the threshold of the ossuary itself, carved into the stone above the doorway, 5 words wait in French. Arrête, c'est ici l'empire de la mort. Stop, this is the empire of the dead. It is a dramatic sentence, and it was designed to be. But what it does not explain is the more unsettling question, the one that follows you through every corridor and stays with you long after you climb those 131 steps back into the daylight. Why? Why did an entire city decide to move millions of its dead underground? And Paris is not alone. Beneath Rome, beneath Palermo, beneath Lima, beneath dozens of other cities around the world, similar decisions were made across centuries and civilizations. The dead were lowered into the earth, arranged, maintained, and sometimes displayed, not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but out of necessity, faith, fear, and sometimes love. This is the story of those decisions, how they were made, what they cost, and what they tell us about the living. Long before Paris built its ossuary, long before the word catacomb became synonymous with skulls and darkness, the practice of underground burial began in Rome, not as a solution to a crisis, but as an act of faith. In the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the Roman Empire cremated its dead. It was efficient, it was customary, and it aligned with the Roman view of the body as a vessel that served its purpose and could be disposed of accordingly. But the early Christians saw it differently. For them, the body was not disposable. It was sacred. It would be resurrected, and therefore it had to be buried whole. This created an immediate practical problem. Roman law prohibited burial within the city walls, and land outside the walls was expensive. The Christian community in Rome was growing, but it was still a minority, often persecuted, always under suspicion, and it could not compete with wealthy Roman families for cemetery space. So the community looked downward. Beneath the fields and roads surrounding Rome lay thick deposits of tufa, a soft volcanic rock that was easy to carve but strong enough to hold its shape. Beginning in the late 2nd century, Under the direction of the church, workers began cutting horizontal tunnels into this rock, long, narrow galleries, sometimes stacked on multiple levels, with rectangular slots carved into the walls to receive bodies. These slots, called loculi, were sealed with marble slabs or tiles, often inscribed with the name of the deceased, a prayer, or a simple symbol: a fish, an anchor, a dove, a shepherd carrying a lamb. The oldest and most important of these complexes is the Catacomb of San Callisto on the Appian Way, named for the deacon Calixtus, who would later become pope. It was established around 220 AD as the official cemetery of the Church of Rome. Over the following centuries, it expanded into a network of roughly 20 kilometers of tunnels on 4 underground levels. Around 500,000 Christians were buried there, including 16 popes and dozens of martyrs. The Catacomb of Priscilla on the Via Salaria is nearly as old and holds what is believed to be the earliest known image of the Virgin Mary, a fresco from the first half of the 3rd century, showing a woman with a child on her lap, while a figure beside her points to a star. There are more than 50 known catacombs in and around Rome, with the combined tunnel length that may exceed several hundred kilometers. Many remain partially explored, and the art found inside them, frescoes depicting scenes from both the Old and New Testaments, from Jonah and the whale to the raising of Lazarus, represents some of the earliest visual expressions of Christian theology. These were not decorations, they were declarations. In a world that demanded they hide their faith, the early Christians chose to paint it on the walls of their tombs. But the Roman catacombs were never intended to be permanent. As Christianity grew in power and influence, eventually becoming the official religion of the empire under Emperor Theodosius in 380 AD, the need for hidden burial faded. Surface cemeteries replaced underground ones. The catacombs fell into disuse, their entrances collapsed or were sealed, and for nearly 1,000 years they were forgotten. It was not until the 16th century that scholars rediscovered them, and not until the 19th that systematic excavation began. By then, a different kind of catacomb had already been built, not out of faith, but out of desperation, in a city 1,000 miles to the north. To understand why Paris built its catacombs, you have to understand what Paris smelled like in the 18th century. And to understand the smell, you have to start with one cemetery. The Cimetière des Saints Innocents, the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents, sat in the heart of Paris, wedged between the Rue Saint-Denis and the sprawling marketplace of Les Halles. It had been in continuous use since at least the 12th century, and by the late 1700s, it was the oldest and busiest burial ground in the city. For more than 600 years, the vast majority of Parisians who died on the right bank ended up there, rich and poor, old and young, victims of plague and famine and ordinary illness, all layered into the same ground. The cemetery used a system of mass graves. Large pits were dug, left open, and filled gradually with bodies over the course of weeks or months. When a pit was full, it was covered with a thin layer of earth, and a new one was opened beside it. Over time, the oldest graves were exhumed, the bones removed and stacked in charnel houses along the cemetery walls, and the ground reused. This cycle repeated for centuries, and by the 18th century, the soil of the cemetery had risen nearly 2 meters above the surrounding streets, a mound of earth so saturated with human remains that it had become a kind of geological formation unto itself. The consequences were appalling. Residents in the surrounding streets reported a stench so powerful it could sour wine and curdle milk stored in nearby cellars. Candles flickered and died in rooms adjacent to the cemetery walls, suffocated by gases seeping through the stone. The well water in the neighborhood was contaminated. People living closest to the cemetery suffered from chronic respiratory ailments, nausea, and fevers. French writer Louis-Sébastien Mercier warned that cadaverous miasmas were poisoning the air of the entire district. The authorities were aware of the problem, but for decades they did little. The Catholic Church resisted any change to the traditional parish burial system, and Parisians themselves, despite the conditions, were reluctant to abandon a cemetery where their families had been buried for generations. It took a catastrophe to force action. In the spring of 1780, a basement wall in a property on the Rue de la Lingerie, immediately adjacent to the cemetery, collapsed. The pressure of decomposing bodies and saturated soil behind it had grown too great. The wall gave way, and a tide of human remains, bones, putrefied flesh, cemetery earth, poured into the cellar. The residents fled. Inspectors arrived to find not just structural failure, but a public health emergency that could no longer be ignored. A royal ordinance was issued. The cemetery of the Holy Innocents was closed permanently. All burials within the city walls were banned, and a question that had been deferred for decades was now urgent. What do you do with the remains of 2 million people buried in the middle of your city? The answer, as it turned out, was already beneath their feet. For centuries, much of Paris had been built from Lutetian limestone quarried from deposits under the left bank. By the 18th century, the quarries had been largely exhausted, leaving behind a vast network of underground tunnels, roughly 300 kilometers of passages, galleries, and chambers, some of them unmapped and forgotten. In 1774, a series of collapses had already revealed the instability of this underground world. Houses on the Rue d'Enfer had fallen into sinkholes, plunging more than 25 meters into the earth. King Louis XVI subsequently established the Inspection Générale des Carrières to map and reinforce the tunnels. Now, the city had both a problem, millions of bones with nowhere to go, and a solution, millions of cubic meters of empty space directly below. The decision was made. Paris would move its dead underground. The work began on April 7, 1786, with a consecration ceremony at the entrance to the Tombe Issoire quarry, south of the city center. Priests blessed the tunnels. The underground space was declared sacred ground, not a dump, not a storage facility, but an ossuary, a place of rest for the Christian dead. And then, night after night, the processions began. After dark, wagons draped in black cloth rolled through the streets of Paris, loaded with bones exhumed from the cemetery of the Holy Innocents. Priests walked alongside, chanting psalms. The route wound south through the city to a shaft near the Rue de la Tombe Issoire, where the remains were lowered into the quarry tunnels below. It was a solemn, deliberate operation, part sanitation project, part religious ritual, and it continued for nearly 2 years before the Innocents was fully emptied. But the Innocents was only the beginning. Over the following decades, bones were transferred from dozens of other Parisian cemeteries: Saint-Étienne-des-Grès, one of the oldest in the city, Notre-Dame de Blanc-Manteau, the Madeleine Cemetery, and the Arency Cemetery, where many victims of the Revolution's guillotine had been hastily buried. The bones of Robespierre, Danton, Lavoisier, Madame du Barry, and Charlotte Corday all ended up in the catacombs, though none can be individually identified. In total, the remains of more than 6 million people were moved, a transfer so vast that it took decades to complete. In those early years, the bones were simply dumped into the tunnels without order. It was not until 1810, when Louis-Étienne Héricourt de Thury became director of the Paris Mine Inspection Service, that the catacombs were transformed into something more deliberate. Héricourt de Thury was an engineer with an aesthetic sensibility. He ordered the bones organized, skulls and femurs arranged in decorative patterns along the corridor walls, with the remaining bones packed behind them. He installed stone tablets bearing inscriptions, quotes from scripture, lines of poetry, philosophical meditations on death, and he placed plaques identifying which cemetery the bones in each section had come from. He salvaged headstones and sculptures from the destroyed cemeteries and used them to create a kind of underground memorial. The result was not a graveyard. It was a designed experience, a walk through death itself, curated for the living. The catacombs quickly became a curiosity. The Count of Artois, the future King Charles X, visited as early as 1787. Napoleon's regime opened them to occasional public tours, and by the mid-19th century, they had become one of the most unusual attractions in Europe, a place where visitors descended into the earth and walked among the organized remains of an entire city's history. But the catacombs served purposes beyond tourism. During the Second World War, both sides of the conflict recognized the strategic value of the tunnel network. The French resistance established a headquarters in the tunnels beneath the left bank, from which Colonel Henri Roll-Tanguy coordinated the insurrection that helped liberate Paris in August 1944. Just a few hundred meters away, the German army had built its own bunker beneath the Lycée Montaigne. For a brief and extraordinary period, the liberators and the occupiers shared the same subterranean world without either side knowing the other was there. And then there is the story of Philibert Aspère. In November 1793, during the chaos of the Revolution, Aspère, a doorkeeper at the Val-de-Grâce Hospital, entered the catacombs through a staircase in the hospital courtyard. His reasons are unknown. He may have been searching for a rumored store of liqueur hidden by monks in the tunnels. Whatever his purpose, he never returned. 11 years later, in 1804, his body was found in the darkness, just a few meters from a staircase that would have led him back to the surface. He was identified only by his hospital key ring and the buttons on his jacket. His grave remains in the catacombs to this day, a quiet reminder that the empire of the dead does not always release its visitors. Paris is the most famous, but it is not alone. Beneath cities across Europe and South America, other civilizations made their own decisions about how to house the dead, and some of those decisions produced places that are, in their own way, even more extraordinary. In Palermo, on the island of Sicily, there is a cemetery where the dead do not lie down. The Capuchin catacombs sit beneath the friary attached to the church of Santa Maria della Pace in the Cuba quarter of the city. They are not catacombs in the Roman sense. They are not carved from tufa, and they were not built for persecuted Christians. They are something else entirely. A vertical cemetery where the dead stand upright along the walls, dressed in their finest clothes, sorted by sex, by profession, and by social rank, like guests at a reception that has been going on for 400 years. It began accidentally. In 1599, during construction work beneath the friary, the Capuchin monks discovered that several brothers who had been buried in the underground chambers had been mummified naturally, preserved by the unusual temperature and humidity of the subsoil. The first body found intact was that of Brother Silvestro da Gubbio. Word spread to the Palermo aristocracy, and soon the city's wealthiest families began requesting the same treatment. They did not want their loved ones sealed in coffins beneath the earth. They wanted them displayed, visible, recognizable. They wanted to be able to visit them, to look them in the face, to change their clothes, to speak to them as if they were still present. The Capuchins developed a method. Bodies were placed in special drying chambers called collatoi for approximately 8 months, then washed with vinegar, dressed, and mounted along the corridor's walls, in niches, on hooks, or in open coffins. Over the next 3 centuries, approximately 8,000 people were interred this way. The corridors are organized by category. There is a hallway for priests, one for professionals, one for soldiers wearing faded silk and lace, and one for children, small bodies dressed as if for a celebration, with ribbons in their hair and tiny shoes on their feet. The catacombs were officially closed to new burials in 1880, but exceptions were made. The last and most famous was in December 1920, when a 2-year-old girl named Rosalia Lombardo died of pneumonia. Her father, Mario, devastated by grief, could not accept that his daughter's body would decay. He turned to Alfredo Salafia, a Palermitan embalmer who had spent years perfecting a method of chemical preservation. Salafia performed a single injection using a formula of formalin, glycerin, zinc salts, alcohol, and salicylic acid, then treated the child's face with paraffin dissolved in ether to maintain the softness of her cheeks. He placed her in a small glass coffin and entrusted her to the Capuchins. She lies there still, at the end of the last corridor, looking so perfectly preserved that visitors have sworn for decades that she opens and closes her eyes, an optical illusion caused by light filtering through the crypt windows and the slight gap in her eyelids, which still reveal a hint of blue iris. The people of Palermo call her the Sleeping Beauty. Salafia died in 1933, and his formula was believed lost until a researcher named Dario Piombino Mascali tracked down the original manuscript through Salafia's descendants, 30 handwritten pages that had been kept by his family for nearly a century. Far from Sicily, on the other side of the Atlantic, another kind of catacomb lies beneath the streets of Lima. The monastery of San Francisco, built in the 17th century, sits above a network of underground crypts that were used as the city's principal burial ground until a public cemetery was established in 1808. The crypts were rediscovered in 1943 during renovation work, and when archaeologists descended, they found the bones of an estimated 25,000 people arranged in deep wells, skulls in one pit, femurs in another, arranged in geometric patterns that suggest deliberate organization, though by whom and when remains unclear.
And in the Czech Republic, beneath the city of Brno, a discovery in 2001 revealed something that had been forgotten for centuries. During a routine archaeological excavation under the Church of St. James, workers broke through into a vast underground chamber filled with human remains. The Brno ossuary, as it came to be known, holds the bones of more than 50,000 people, victims of plague, cholera, and the 30 Years' War, making it the second largest ossuary in Europe after the Paris catacombs. It had lain undisturbed and unknown since the 18th century. But perhaps the most surprising chapter of the catacomb story is not ancient at all. It is happening now beneath the streets of modern Paris. The public section of the Paris Catacombs, the tourist route with its neatly arranged bones and its dramatic inscriptions, covers approximately 1.5 kilometers. The total tunnel network beneath the city stretches for roughly 300 kilometers. The rest is off-limits, sealed by law since 1955, patrolled sporadically by a small unit of the Paris police. But for decades, a subculture of urban explorers known as cataphiles has been slipping underground through manholes, ventilation shafts, and hidden entrances, turning the forbidden tunnels into a kind of parallel city. They hold parties in underground chambers, they paint murals on the walls, they bring sound systems, food, and wine. Some passages have been decorated so extensively that they resemble underground art galleries. And in September 2004, during a training exercise in an uncharted section beneath the Trocadero, directly across the Seine from the Eiffel Tower, police stumbled on something that stunned even the most experienced officers. Behind a tarpaulin marked "Building Site, No Access," they found a tunnel equipped with a closed-circuit camera and a tape recorder rigged to play the sound of barking dogs. Beyond that, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern, roughly 400 square meters, fitted with a full-sized cinema screen, projection equipment, film reels, tiered seating carved into the rock, a fully stocked bar, and a restaurant with tables, chairs, and a pressure cooker for making couscous. The entire installation was powered by a professionally wired electrical line with at least 3 independent phone lines. 3 days later, when police returned with engineers from the French Electricity Board, the power and phone lines had been cut. In the middle of the empty floor lay a single note: "Do not try to find us." A group called La Mexicaine de Perforación, the Mexican Consolidated Drilling Authority, eventually claimed responsibility. A photographer connected to the group told French radio that the discovery was a shame, but not the end of the world. He said there were a dozen more installations just like it. You guys have no idea what's down there. He was probably right. Every year, hundreds of cataphiles are caught and fined. The standard penalty is a modest €60, and every year they go back. The tunnels are too vast, too complex, and too poorly mapped for any police force to fully control. The cataphiles are not vandals. Most of them see themselves as custodians of a hidden world that the city above has chosen to forget. They clean the tunnels, they maintain the murals, they guide newcomers through the safest routes, and in doing so, they have created something the original builders of the catacombs never intended: a living underground culture layered on top of the dead. Every city in this story faced the same question, even if they never stated it aloud. What do we owe the dead? The early Christians in Rome answered with faith. The body was sacred, destined for resurrection, and it deserved a resting place that reflected that promise, even if it meant carving an entire city of tunnels beneath the earth, painting its walls with scenes of salvation, and sealing each grave with a prayer. For them, the catacombs were not a repository. They were an expression of hope. 18th century Paris answered with necessity. The living could no longer share their city with the dead, not because they had stopped caring, but because the sheer volume of remains had become a physical threat. The catacombs were a public health measure, a bureaucratic solution, a transfer of bones from one darkness to another. And yet, when Héricard de Thury arranged those skulls into patterns and carved inscriptions into the stone, he was doing something more than engineering. He was creating a monument, a place where the anonymous dead could still command the attention and perhaps the reverence of the living.
Palermo answered with intimacy. The Capuchins and the families they served refused to let death impose distance. They dressed their dead, mounted them on walls, visited them on Sundays, changed their clothes with the seasons. To modern eyes, it can seem macabre, but the impulse behind it is recognizable. A refusal to accept that a person you loved as simply disappeared. When Mario Lombardo brought his daughter to Alfredo Salafia, he was not preserving a body. He was holding on to a presence. And the cataphiles of modern Paris have given their own answer, one that nobody planned. By slipping underground to paint, to build, to gather in the dark, they have turned a place of death into a place of defiant life. The tunnels were built to extract stone, repurposed to store bones, and are now being reclaimed by the living for reasons that have nothing to do with the dead at all, and yet everything to do with the same impulse that drove every decision in this story: the need to make meaning out of the space beneath our feet. 6 million bones in Paris, 500,000 in the tunnels of Rome, 8,000 mummified bodies standing upright in Palermo, 50,000 skeletons in a forgotten chamber under Brno, 25,000 skulls arranged in geometric patterns beneath a monastery in Lima. The numbers are staggering, and yet they are not the point. The point is that in every case, someone decided these remains mattered. Someone carried them, arranged them, labeled them, decorated the walls around them, wrote inscriptions above them, or simply refused to let them be forgotten. We build our cities on top of the dead. We always have. The question is whether we remember that, and what we do with the knowledge. In Paris, at the end of the public tour, visitors climb 131 steps back to the surface and emerge blinking into the daylight on a quiet street near the Place d'Enfert Rochereau. The traffic is moving. People are walking their dogs. A cafe across the street is serving lunch. Everything is ordinary. And directly below their feet, stretching for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, the empire of the dead continues in silence, vast, patient, and untroubled by the noise above. Arrête, c'est ici l'empire de la mort. The first time you read that sentence, it sounds like a warning. The second time, it sounds like an invitation.